The summer of 1942 in the South Pacific was not a season of warmth. It was a season of fear, hunger, and sleepless nights. The battle for Guadalcanal had begun, and with it came one of the most brutal contests of endurance in modern warfare. For months, the island's skies and seas had burned with the fire of war. During the day, American fighters like the Wildcat and Dauntless ruled the heavens, striking Japanese convoys that dared to approach. But when the sun fell behind the jungle hills, everything changed. Darkness belonged to Japan. The Imperial Navy's Tokyo Express, columns of destroyers and transport ships, raced down the Slot, a narrow sea corridor between the Solomon Islands, bringing fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies to their garrisons on Guadalcanal. The Americans called it the Cactus Express, but they cursed it in silence. Each night the thunder of Japanese guns echoed across the beaches, and each morning Marines found new craters, new wrecks, and new dead. The U.S. Navy had radar, but no way to fight effectively in the dark. Fighters couldn't see, and bombers couldn't hit. It seemed that night itself was an enemy. By late 1942, Admiral William Bull Halsey and the commanders of the South Pacific were desperate for a solution. The Japanese could move by night without challenge, slipping past destroyers and outpacing submarines. Every attempt to attack their convoys after sundown ended in frustration or disaster. "We ruled the day," one U.S. Navy officer wrote, "but they owned the night." In the dim hangars of Espiritu Santo and Tulagi, a few officers began to toy with an idea that seemed more like madness than strategy. They turned their eyes to the PBY Catalina, a slow, ungainly flying boat with long, graceful wings and the silhouette of a pelican. Designed before the war as a patrol and rescue aircraft, the Catalina had no armor, no speed, and almost no chance of surviving a dogfight. Pilots joked that PBY stood for "push back yonder" or "pray before you yield." But as the Navy's faster planes and warships struggled against the darkness, this awkward, forgotten aircraft offered one advantage none of them had: endurance. The Catalina could stay aloft for over 15 hours, glide silently with engines throttled down, and land on the open ocean. More importantly, it could fly low and slow enough to find ships in the shadows. That endurance made it a perfect scout, if only it could survive long enough to attack. One of the first to see its potential was Lieutenant Commander Clarence Taff and his squadron, Patrol Squadron VP-12. He began experimenting with night operations, flying reconnaissance missions in near total darkness. The crews stripped unnecessary equipment to lighten the load, giving the old plane a little more agility. At first, these missions were unarmed, purely for observation. But after several successful sorties, the crews began to think, what if we could do more than watch? In early November, a handful of mechanics at Espiritu Santo began to paint one of the Catalinas entirely black. There was no official order, no authorization, just improvisation. They mixed matte paint by hand, brushing layer after layer until the silver skin of the flying boat absorbed every glint of moonlight. The transformation was eerie. On the ground, it looked like a shadow. In the sky, it disappeared completely. When the first crew took it up on a night patrol, their own escorts lost sight of them within minutes. It worked. Soon, more squadrons followed. They scrounged for dark paint from any source: naval stores, ship hulls, and even tar. The crews covered every inch: fuselage, engines, wings, and even the national insignia. Only the exhausts glowed faintly red in the night. Radar sets, primitive but effective, were installed. Pilots learned to fly by instruments, using altimeters and stopwatches instead of stars. The blackened aircraft became hunters of the dark, stalking the Tokyo Express in silence. At first, their missions were simple shadowing runs, tracking Japanese convoys so Allied surface ships could intercept them. But as confidence grew, The Catalinas began to carry bombs. Using flares and moonlight for guidance, they dropped 500-pounders from altitudes barely higher than the treetops. Their success shocked even their own commanders. Japanese sailors accustomed to safety after dusk suddenly found death descending from the night sky. Reports began to reach Tokyo of American aircraft attacking at 2 a.m., flying so low they could be heard before they were seen. Crews claimed they had been assaulted by black ghosts that vanished into the clouds before searchlights could find them. At first, Japanese officers dismissed the tales as panic, but when wreckage of sunken ships began to pile up, destroyers, transports, and cargo vessels, they realized something terrifying was happening. The Americans had learned to fight in the dark. By late 1942, the experiment had become an organized force. The Navy designated specific Catalina squadrons for nocturnal attack missions, officially giving them the name Black Cats. Their insignia, an angry black cat clutching a torpedo in its claws, began to appear on aircraft across the South Pacific. The crews embraced the name with pride. They painted eyes on the nose cones, wore black flight suits, and flew missions that defied every rule of aviation safety. To fly a Black Cat mission was to gamble with death. Pilots navigated by faint moonlight over black ocean, without radio contact or visual landmarks. One mistake meant vanishing forever into the sea. Yet the crews loved their aircraft. "She may look like a bathtub with wings, but she gets us home," one pilot said. The Catalina's twin engines, each humming like a lullaby, became a sound the crews trusted with their lives. Their base at Tulagi became a hive of innovation. Ground crews worked through the night repairing bullet holes and reloading bombs, while radar operators recalibrated sets by lantern light. They learned to coordinate with PT boats and destroyers, forming deadly night hunting packs. When one Catalina spotted a Japanese convoy, it flared the sky with illumination bombs, drawing enemy fire while the others swooped in for the kill. The first major success came in January 1943. A Black Cat from VP-12 discovered a Japanese destroyer near Colombaringa. Approaching from the moon's shadow, the Catalina glided down to 200 feet and released two 500-pounders. Both struck the stern. The destroyer erupted in flames and sank within minutes. The Catalina's crew returned to base without a scratch. When news spread through the Allied camps, it lifted morale like no victory before. The Japanese, humiliated and enraged, began calling the mysterious planes Yoru no Kuro Neko, Black Cats of the Night. It was a name that stuck. By the beginning of 1943, the Black Cats had become the eyes and claws of the Allied night. The once helpless skies over Guadalcanal were now filled with hunters whose strength lay not in speed, but in silence. For the first time in the Pacific War, the night no longer belonged to Japan. The transformation of the PBY Catalina from a lumbering scout plane into a nocturnal predator didn't begin in laboratories or factories. It began on a humid airstrip in the Solomon Islands, built from crushed coral and sweat. It was a product of improvisation, ingenuity, and desperation. By the end of 1942, the Allied war effort in the Pacific was still fragile. The victory at Guadalcanal was far from certain. Every ton of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, and every ounce of courage had to be ferried across thousands of miles of ocean under constant threat of Japanese attack. The Tokyo Express still raced down the slot almost every night, delivering reinforcements and evacuating wounded. American destroyers and cruisers had tried to stop them, but night after night, the Imperial Navy slipped through, unseen, unstoppable. The answer, as strange as it seemed, would come from a flying boat built before radar was even standard equipment. The consolidated PBY Catalina had been designed in the 1930s as a patrol and rescue aircraft, slow, heavy, and stable.
Its long gull-like wings stretched 104 feet across, and its hull-shaped fuselage allowed it to land on water. Before the war, it had served quietly in reconnaissance roles, patrolling coasts and escorting convoys. But by 1942, compared to fast new aircraft like the B-17 or the Grumman F-4F, the Catalina seemed ancient. It cruised at just 125 miles per hour, barely faster than some enemy fighters at idle. Japanese pilots mocked it as the flying cow. Yet, beneath its awkward shape was something priceless: range. It could fly 2,500 miles without refueling, loiter for 18 hours, and carry bombs or torpedoes when needed. The aircraft that no one expected to fight became the one that could fight the longest. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Taff and his crews of Patrol Squadron VP-12 began to see what others had overlooked. If the Catalina couldn't compete in daylight, why not fight where no one else could? In the dark. The idea was radical. Night flight in the early 1940s was still primitive and dangerous. Aircraft lacked advanced navigation aids, and Japanese ships were equipped with searchlights and anti-aircraft guns designed to shred low-flying targets. But Taff and his men had something the Japanese did not: an early generation of radar. The radar sets were crude, bulky systems with glowing green screens, the kind that flickered and hummed like a heartbeat. They required a dedicated operator who could interpret the faint arcs and blips that marked the position of ships or coastlines. Still, in trained hands, they could see through night and storm alike. The Catalinas carrying radar became the first true night hunters of the Pacific. At first, they experimented cautiously. Flying at altitudes under 1,000 feet, they crept along the dark horizon, learning to read the ocean by moonlight. They practiced bombing runs with dimmed instruments, cutting engines to glide silently above target areas. The missions were exhausting, 12, sometimes 16 hours, and every takeoff or landing in black water risked disaster. But slowly the crews grew confident. They painted over their shiny aluminum exteriors with matte black paint, scavenged from Navy stores or mixed with engine oil to dull the reflection of the moon. Soon, entire squadrons were joining the experiment. VP-12 was followed by VP-33, VP-54, and others, operating from rough bases at Tulagi, Espiritu Santo, and New Georgia. They became a fraternity of innovators. Crews wired extra fuel tanks into the wings, added field-modified bomb racks, and mounted machine guns for strafing. They learned to use flares tactically, not to illuminate their targets fully, but to dazzle Japanese gunners. When a flare burst over the ocean, the enemy's eyes were blinded by light, while the Catalina, hidden in shadow, slipped in from another angle. Each mission refined their craft. Some pilots used moonlight glinting off ship wakes to navigate. Others dropped smoke bombs behind targets to mask their escape. The aircraft's huge wings gave it stability in the turbulent coastal winds that plagued the Solomon Islands, and its amphibious design allowed it to land on lagoons to pick up downed pilots or stranded sailors, sometimes right under enemy fire. By early 1943, the Black Cats had formally earned their name. The squadrons adopted the image of a snarling black cat clutching a torpedo, painted proudly on each fuselage. The men took the name to heart. They began wearing black uniforms and helmets, joking that they were part of the Navy's midnight shift. Their missions grew bolder, attacking convoys between Rabaul and Bougainville, harassing barges near New Britain, and prowling the waters of the Bismarck Sea. Japanese reports began to mention the Yoru no Kuro Neko, the Black Cats of the Night. Sailors swore they could hear the drone of engines just before bombs exploded, but could never spot the aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into the darkness. When the searchlights swept the sky, there was nothing there, only stars. The Black Cats had become ghosts. What made them so effective wasn't just their stealth, it was their psychology. Japanese convoys had long relied on the protection of night, Darkness was their armor. The Black Cats stripped that away. Now the sea itself felt haunted. Every ripple might conceal an American plane. Every shadow could bring sudden fire from above. The Imperial Navy began to dread the hours after dusk. Admiral Halsey soon expanded the program, ordering more squadrons equipped for night operations. Resources were scarce, so crews continued to improvise, installing radar from damaged planes, swapping parts, even trading whiskey for spare fuel pumps. Maintenance crews painted the edges of propeller blades black to reduce flashes from the exhaust. The PBY Catalina, once dismissed as outdated, was becoming the centerpiece of an entirely new kind of warfare: aerial night interdiction. But behind the success was constant strain. Night flying demanded absolute discipline. A moment's lapse in concentration could send a plane plunging into the ocean. The black-painted aircraft absorbed heat during the day and became ovens under the Pacific sun. When missions stretched past dawn, the Black Cats were easy prey for Japanese Zeros. Pilots had to choose: risk the daylight or ditch in the sea and hope for rescue. Still, they flew. For every Catalina that didn't return, another took off that night. As one pilot wrote in his logbook, "We owned the night, but the night owned us too." By mid-1943, the Black Cats were no longer an experiment. They were a weapon. In just 6 months, they had sunk or damaged dozens of Japanese vessels and crippled nighttime resupply routes across the Solomon Islands. The Imperial Navy, which had once been the master of night warfare, was now losing its convoys to a force it could neither see nor stop. In the darkness over Guadalcanal, the balance of power had shifted, and it was the black-painted wings of the PBY Catalina that turned the tide.
By mid-1943, the Black Cats had evolved from a desperate improvisation into one of the most effective and feared units in the Pacific. Their success came not from superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but from mastery of an environment that terrified everyone else: the night. Over the jungles and seas of the Solomon Islands, where the stars were sharp as knives and the horizon vanished into darkness, the Black Cats became predators that struck unseen and vanished before dawn. They had turned one of war's greatest dangers into their greatest weapon. The key to their power was a combination of endurance, stealth, and innovation. The PBY Catalina, with its immense 104-foot wingspan and long fuel range, could loiter over an area for hours, waiting patiently for its prey. On radar, Japanese ships appeared as faint white sparks. The radar operator, headphones pressed tight, would call out course and distance: 2 contacts, bearing 160, 10 miles. The pilot, sweating in the heat of the cockpit, would nod silently and turn the black-painted aircraft toward the target. Below, the ocean glimmered faintly under the moon. A typical Black Cat attack began in silence. The crew would descend to 500 feet, throttling engines to idle, gliding almost noiselessly until they were just above the water. Sometimes they flew so low that their wing floats brushed the waves. The bombs were armed manually. The bombardier peered through the darkness, looking for the faint white wakes of enemy destroyers. When the time came, he pulled the release. The Catalina bucked as its payload dropped, and seconds later, a flash, a roar, and a column of flame rising from the sea. For the Japanese sailors, the experience was terrifying. They had been trained to fight under the cover of darkness, but now darkness had turned against them. The enemy they couldn't see was striking from the void. Some called the attacks ghost fire or phantom lightning. On more than one occasion, Japanese survivors swore the Americans had invented invisible aircraft. In reality, it was nothing more than black paint, moonlight, and the courage of a handful of men flying machines older than most of them were. One of the first major Black Cat victories came on the night of March 3, 1943, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Allied intelligence had learned that a convoy of 8 Japanese transports and 8 destroyers was carrying thousands of troops to reinforce Lae in New Guinea. While American bombers attacked by day, the Black Cats prowled at night. They harassed the convoy with bombs and flares, forcing it to zigzag and scatter. Each time the ships regrouped, another Catalina appeared out of nowhere,
dropping more flares and explosives. When daylight came, the convoy was disorganized, an easy target for B-25s and Beaufighters. By the end of the battle, all 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers went to the bottom of the sea. The Black Cats hadn't struck the final blows, but they had made them possible. From that point on, the Japanese knew the night was no longer safe. They began altering their routes, hugging coastlines and cutting engines when moonlight was strong. But the Black Cats adapted again. They learned to use radar to follow coastlines and ambush convoys hiding in bays. Some crews even synchronized attacks with submarines and PT boats, coordinating via coded flashes or preset timing. The Black Cats became a central node in the Allied hunter-killer strategy, the unseen eyes of a network that hunted Japanese supply lines from the Solomons to the Bismarck Archipelago. Their ingenuity extended beyond combat. Lacking factory support, the men improvised constantly. They installed homemade radar altimeters, rewired searchlights, and even strapped 20mm cannons scavenged from wrecks onto their fuselages for strafing runs. Mechanics covered cockpit windows with blackout curtains so the glow of instruments wouldn't betray them. Many of these modifications were made under palm trees, with mosquitoes buzzing and the sound of surf echoing nearby. "We weren't engineers," one crewman later said, "but we had duct tape, coffee, and no choice." Perhaps the greatest weapon the Black Cats possessed, though, was patience. They didn't hunt in swarms or waves. They hunted in ones and twos, slipping through the night like shadows. Their pilots developed a sixth sense for the sea. They could tell a destroyer's speed by the shape of its wake, or its heading by the angle of reflected moonlight. They flew through storms, between mountain ridges, and over enemy airfields, guided by instinct and the faint hum of their engines. Despite their reputation, the missions were far from glamorous. The men endured 14-hour flights in sweltering heat, their uniforms soaked with sweat, eyes burning from staring into the dark. The Catalina's cabin was unpressurized, unheated, and filled with the constant vibration of twin radial engines. Navigation errors were deadly. One wrong bearing could send the plane hundreds of miles off course into empty ocean. Many never returned. Those who did learned to recognize the distinct smell of the aircraft: oil, salt, and cordite, the scent of survival. In rare moments between missions, they patched up their planes and repainted the black skins that chipped under the tropical sun. They drank warm coffee, shared cigarettes, and told stories of close calls. One crew recounted how they'd glided in on a Japanese convoy, dropped bombs at mast height, and then had to restart their engines by hand-cranking propellers mid-air. Another swore they had seen their own reflection in the water just before pulling up from a torpedo run. "You don't fly the cat, you persuade her," one pilot said. By late 1943, the Black Cat's success was undeniable. They had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese ships, transports, destroyers, even cruisers, and destroyed countless barges and supply dumps along the New Guinea coast. Their operations forced Japan to shift its entire logistical network, rerouting convoys to avoid the areas they haunted. In effect, the Black Cats had achieved strategic dominance without a single large-scale engagement. And yet their greatest impact wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Japanese radio operators began transmitting nervous reports of black aircraft with no sound. Sailors refused to sleep at night, knowing that somewhere in the dark sky, unseen eyes were watching. The Japanese began to call them Ma no Neko, meaning demons of the night. The Americans, hearing this, adopted it proudly. By the end of the year, the Black Cat's legend had spread across the Pacific. Crews and other theaters began painting their own aircraft black in imitation. From the Aleutians to the Philippines, night operations became a core part of Allied air strategy. What had started as a handful of experimental flights in the Solomons had turned into a doctrine that would reshape aerial warfare for decades. And in every mission report, the same line appeared again and again. Enemy ships attacked at night, results, several sunk. Our losses? None. In the dark, over the silent waves of the Pacific, the Black Cats had done what no one else could. They had turned the night into their ally and fear into a weapon.
By 1944, the legend of the Black Cats had spread far beyond the Solomon Islands. What had begun as an improvised experiment in a backwater theater had grown into a cornerstone of the Allied night war across the Pacific. Their reputation was whispered in both English and Japanese, a name that evoked awe and fear: the Black Cats of Guadalcanal. To Allied airmen, they were the men who tamed the darkness. To the Japanese, they were the black demons that came from nowhere, struck without warning, and disappeared into the stars. But behind the legend was the cold, hard reality of relentless combat. Night after night, the Black Cats flew their lonely patrols, tracing the same invisible lines over black water, hunting the unseen. There were no searchlights to guide them, no moonlit silhouettes to frame their targets, only the faint echoes on radar screens and the intuition of men who had learned to think in darkness. Their missions ranged from ship interdiction to reconnaissance, air-sea rescue, and even psychological warfare. The Catalinas became omnipresent: bombers, scouts, lifeboats, and ghosts all in one. The Black Cats' most famous actions took place during the campaigns for New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago, where Japanese shipping lanes were the lifelines of their forces. The Imperial Navy had built a supply system that snaked across island chains, convoys that moved only at night to avoid American aircraft. For months, the system had worked, but when the Black Cats arrived, the night ceased to be a sanctuary. Operating from forward bases at Tulagi, Milne Bay, and later Manus Island, the squadrons blanketed the night sky with long, overlapping patrols. Their crews coordinated with radar stations and coast watchers, often receiving real-time updates via coded Morse flashes from isolated Allied scouts hidden in the jungle. When a convoy was detected, the nearest cat would close in low and slow, using radar to fix the target before dropping flares to mark the attack zone. Then the hunters began their dance. A typical strike might involve 2 or 3 Catalinas working together. The lead plane illuminated the area with parachute flares, long burning magnesium fires that bathed the ocean in an unearthly white glow. The second and third aircraft attacked from different directions, their bombs and depth charges erupting around the ships in blinding flashes. The Japanese gunners, dazzled by light and smoke, fired blindly into the sky. By the time they adjusted their aim, the Cats were gone, throttling up and banking into the black horizon. In one documented mission in October 1943, a PBY from VP-11 intercepted a Japanese convoy near the Shortland Islands. The crew descended to just 300 feet, bombed 2 transports, and escaped through anti-aircraft fire so thick it looked like a burning net. One engine was shot out, the tail was shredded, and 2 crewmen were wounded, but they made it back to base 400 miles away. When the crippled plane landed, ground crews counted 147 bullet holes in its fuselage. The next night, the same aircraft was patched with tin and sent out again. That was the rhythm of the Black Cats: damaged, repaired, and airborne before dawn. As 1943 turned to 1944, the squadron's reach extended further north to Rabaul, Japan's major stronghold in the South Pacific. Rabaul's harbor teemed with shipping and anti-aircraft guns, and daylight attacks cost the Allies dearly. But the Black Cats struck when the defenders were asleep. Their radar-guided raids disrupted harbor operations for weeks, forcing the Japanese to disperse their fleets and move supplies in smaller convoys. During these missions, the Catalinas also pioneered another innovation: flare coordination. Before each major daylight bombing raid, Black Cats flew ahead at night, dropping flares and markers to identify targets for the next morning's B-24 and B-25 strikes. It was the earliest example of what would later become pathfinding, the method used by bombers in Europe and decades later in Vietnam and the Gulf War. The slow, steady PBY had become the blueprint for modern nocturnal air tactics. Their contribution wasn't limited to destruction. The same black-painted aircraft that terrorized the Tokyo Express also saved lives.
The Black Cats performed air-sea rescues so daring they bordered on insanity, landing on rough open water to pull downed airmen or shipwrecked sailors from the Pacific. In one operation near Bougainville, a Catalina crew rescued 9 survivors from a burning B-24 while Japanese patrol boats closed in. The Cat took off under fire, barely clearing the waves, its hull riddled with shrapnel. The rescued pilot later said, "It was like being lifted from hell by angels with engines." For the Japanese, the impact was catastrophic. Their entire logistical system began to collapse. The Black Cats had forced them to slow their convoys, scatter their ships, and move only during heavy weather. This crippled Japan's ability to resupply isolated garrisons on islands like Guadalcanal, New Britain, and New Guinea. When American ground forces advanced, they found enemy troops starving, their equipment rusting, their ammunition almost gone. The invisible hand that strangled those islands had belonged to the Black Cats. But the toll on the crews was heavy. Flying in darkness for endless hours, staring into green radar screens, and living on caffeine and nerves took a psychological toll that few could endure indefinitely. Many crews suffered from night blindness and exhaustion. Accidents were common. Catalinas collided in the dark, crashed into mountains, or disappeared over the ocean without a trace. For every celebrated victory, there were quiet losses that never made the headlines. Still, morale among the Black Cats remained high. They developed a reputation for independence and mischief. Ground crews often painted mascots, black cats with glowing eyes on the fuselage, along with the names of wives, girlfriends, or jokes like Midnight Madness, Moonlight Queen, Witchcraft. They flew barefoot, smoked in the cockpit, and drank strong coffee mixed with rum before takeoff. They were, as one Navy officer put it, the pirates of the night sky. By early 1944, their dominance had reached such proportions that the Imperial Japanese Navy began referring to the waters around Guadalcanal and the Solomons as the Cat's Sea. Every major Japanese naval withdrawal in the South Pacific, from Rabaul, from New Georgia, from Bougainville, took place under cover of storms or with heavy fighter escort just to avoid the PBYs. In the spring of that year, Admiral Halsey's staff compiled a report summarizing the Black Cats' achievements. It listed over 400 Japanese vessels sunk or damaged, thousands of tons of supplies destroyed, and hundreds of Allied airmen rescued. The document ended with a single line that captured their spirit. "When the sun goes down, the enemy hides, and we go hunting." Their operations would continue into 1945, but by then the world of warfare was changing fast. New night fighters like the radar-equipped Hellcat and Corsair were taking over their role. The Black Cats had paved the way, but the future was coming, and their shadows would soon give way to JetCon trails. Still, in the dark over the Pacific, their legacy burned bright. They had shown that courage and ingenuity could make even the slowest aircraft a weapon of terror, and that sometimes victory belonged not to those who fought in daylight, but to those who learned to master the night. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world began to forget the sound of night engines over the Pacific. New machines, jets, radar-guided bombers, and sleek metal fighters were stealing the headlines. Yet among those who'd lived through the war, there remained a quiet reverence for the black-painted PBYs that had ruled the night. The Black Cats of Guadalcanal were never as famous as the flying fortresses of Europe or the Hellcats of the carrier decks, but their shadows stretched long across history. Their story was one of transformation, how a slow, ungainly patrol plane became a weapon that redefined the very nature of air warfare. The PBY Catalina itself was already an anachronism by 1945. Designed in the 1930s by Consolidated Aircraft, it had been built for endurance, not combat. But in the hands of the Black Cats, it became a platform of innovation. They had proven that darkness was not a barrier, but a battlefield, and that even a seemingly obsolete aircraft could dominate it with the right tactics, courage, and creativity. In many ways, the Black Cats invented modern night warfare. Before them, the night sky was chaos. No reliable radar, no coordinated communication, no doctrine. After them, it became an organized domain. The tactics they pioneered, radar navigation, flare illumination, low-altitude bombing, and long-duration interdiction, were studied and refined in every major air force after the war. In the early years of the Cold War, those lessons bore fruit. The U.S. Navy and Air Force established permanent night attack and all-weather squadrons. Many of their instructors were former Black Cat pilots who'd returned home, taught at flight schools, and written manuals based on their wartime experience. Concepts like nocturnal area denial and stealth illumination were born directly from their missions over the Solomon Islands. Even the development of infrared sensors and radar-guided attack aircraft drew from reports written by Black Cat crews who described how they felt targets before they saw them. The aircraft itself also lived on. While new planes replaced it in frontline service, hundreds of Catalinas continued flying through the 1950s and beyond. Some served as air-sea rescue planes during the Korean War, others patrolled Arctic waters during the Cold War, and a few found civilian lives as firefighting aircraft, dropping water on forest fires across America, Canada, and Australia. The same rugged hulls that once carried bombs now carried life, a fitting transformation for machines that had saved so many during war. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy of the Black Cats lay not in technology, but in spirit. They embodied the improvisational genius that defined the Allied war effort. Men who refused to accept the limitations of their machines, their orders, or even the laws of night and day. Their story reminded the world that innovation doesn't come from laboratories alone, but from the desperation and imagination of those at the front. For the men who flew those missions, the memories never faded. Pilots and crewmen gathered for reunions in the decades after the war, their hair silver now, their hands still marked by the burns of long-forgotten engines. They would tell stories of the old days, of flying low over black seas, of the smell of cordite and salt, of the faint glow of radar screens and the thrill of seeing an explosion bloom on the horizon. When asked if they had been afraid, most simply smiled. "Every night," one said. "But the cat was family. She took care of us." Historians, too, began to understand the scale of their impact. By the end of the war, the Black Cats had flown over 19,000 combat sorties, sunk or damaged more than 400 Japanese ships, and rescued over 1,200 Allied airmen and sailors. Their operations stretched from the Solomon Islands to the Philippines, from the Bismarck Sea to the coast of China. They had forced the Japanese to abandon nighttime shipping altogether in vast sections of the Pacific. In doing so, they starved entire garrisons, hastened the collapse of Japan's island empire, and cleared the path for the American advance. The Japanese, for their part, remembered them vividly. In post-war interviews, several Imperial Navy officers admitted that the Black Cats were among the most feared adversaries they faced. One described them as shadows that hunted the sea. Another said, "We could not fight what we could not see." It was a testament not just to the aircraft, but to the men who had mastered it. In 1987, the U.S. Navy officially recognized the Black Cats with a unit commendation, honoring their extraordinary heroism and pioneering tactics in nocturnal warfare. Surviving Catalinas were restored in museums across the world, one in Pensacola, another in Australia, one more in the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center. Each carried the emblem of a snarling black cat clutching a torpedo, its yellow eyes gleaming beneath faded paint. At air shows today, when a restored Catalina starts its engines, a deep, resonant hum rolls across the field, the same sound that once echoed over Guadalcanal's dark waters. Children watch, unaware that they are hearing the heartbeat of a legend born in shadow. Veterans stand quietly, eyes wet, remembering nights when courage flew without light. In the grand narrative of World War II, the Black Cats are often overlooked between the towering names of Midway, Normandy, and the Bulge. Yet in their quiet, persistent way, they accomplished something no one else could. They turned fear itself into a weapon. They made the night belong to the Allies. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won by the loudest guns, but by the silent wings that move unseen. Their motto, never officially written but passed from crew to crew, captured it best. "We own the night." And for 3 long years, across 1,000 miles of black ocean, they truly did.